Hello and welcome to GenQA's Focus On webinar, focusing on single nucleotide variant classification. It's all about the evidence. So I'm delighted to introduce our panel and our presenters for today's session. We are joined with by Dr. Dave Cregeen, who is the Deputy Director for Molecular Genetics at GenQA, and also Farah Kawaja, who is also Deputy Director, and between them over the years they have been delivering the molecular genetics assessments. I'm also delighted to be joined by David Moore, who's the Deputy Head of Molecular Genetics in NHS Lothian in Edinburgh. But David has really been an essential part of the EQA delivery team for many, many years now, and has been heavily involved in delivering the SNV classification EQAs and really evolving it over time. So today we'll hear the story of how things have progressed and also where we are at the moment. I'm Sandy Deans, I'm Director of GenQA, and I have a pleasure to chair the call today. So our webinar topics are, David is going to give us a presentation about the pathogenicity of germline sequence variants EQA, focusing on the SNV classifications for the 22-23 EQAs, which we're now planning for, and also we'll get some summary of the other variant classifications EQAs that really have evolved out of the success of the SNVs. So I would just like to now introduce David to tell us about really the story of the evolution of the SNV classification EQAs as we've gone forward. So David, over to you, please. Thank you.
The variant interpretation EQA was first run as a pilot in 2012 with only 30 participating laboratories. Initial aims were to gauge the consistency in variant assessment between the laboratories, including the guidelines being used, the classification systems being used, and ultimately the final classification being generated by the labs. It also provided a generic EQA run by GenQA for the labs not participating in one of the core schemes. The scheme grew to 75 participants in 2021. It was particularly relevant in 2012 as NGS was only just being introduced to the laboratories. This was a shift from a small number of heavy-hitting genes accounting for a substantial mutational load for each of the disorders, with accompanying locus-specific databases, to a much more comprehensive list of genes that covered a larger majority of the variants associated with those disorders, but had not been previously analyzed due to the limitations of Sanger sequencing and the law of diminishing returns. It was also to try and combat the specter of getting the same variant badged two different ways by different laboratories. Ultimately, it's to avoid adverse clinical impact. Getting the wrong, having the wrong variant being badged as the pathogenic variant in that family can lead to issues for that individual and within the family. It can lead to inappropriate presymptomatic testing for other family members. It can also lead to variants that should be followed up not being followed up, or variants that shouldn't be followed up being followed up. Another common area issue was scoring the variant in the context of the patient. When a clearly pathogenic variant was detected in an autosomal recessive gene with no detectable second variant, it was quite routinely being classified as a UV for that individual. As with everything, no thought was unique, and various guidelines were produced at the same time to try and standardize the approach for variant interpretation and classification. 2008, PLON generated a set of guidelines specifically for cancer susceptibility. 2013, the best practice guidelines were generated for ACGS to try and standardize the approach for variant interpretation. And in 2015, Richards et al. Produced the guidelines for the interpretation that's now been the foundation for the ACMG and the ACGS guidelines that we currently use. 2015 provided a great general marker for variant classification, and it also had an attempt at weighting the evidence being used that no previous guidelines had. However, there's exceptions to every rule, and this has led to various amendments and qualifiers being generated since the 2015 guidelines were published. It's been both a blessing and a curse for this EQA scheme. There was the initial time lag for uptake for the Richards guidelines, with some labs quick to adopt them while others they were sticking to more traditional methods. Then there was the pickup of updates. Some labs are very quick to do it, some labs aren't. So the addition of more variation. So with the modifying criteria has been extremely useful, but has led to a much more variation in some of the returns. And then also with variety of different versions being available, this leads to different labs using different types of guideline. This creates issues when defining specific marking criteria, as there are different labs using different approaches, and the returns have to be marked against the criteria that that lab is using and not by a generic set. And that's one of the reasons why the participant scoring system is requested as part of the results submission. In the 2021 scheme, there were 30 labs still using the ACMG 2015, one using the ACGS 2019, 8 using a blend of the 2020 ACGS and 2015 ACMG, and 35 using the 2020 ACGS, and 1 still using an in-house method and a blend of 2020 and 2015. There can be quite a few routes to the same classification, which is the desired endpoint, but some of the routes can be overtly wrong. So the aim of the scheme is to stamp those out when evidence is being used in the wrong way. It may not have a bearing on the actual EQA case if the correct classification is reached, but it could have an adverse effect in a real diagnostic situation and result in a misclassification. Ultimately, variant calling is still subjective. It has lessened, but it's still a factor. Different labs have different experiences with different types of disorders, and this may shape how they classify their variants. There's even variation within laboratories with different staff members having exposure to different cases. There's obviously more caution applied when labs are dealing with an unfamiliar gene. And if this isn't a common occurrence for the lab, i.e. a lab doesn't offer WES, then it can be that these labs are more tentative than other labs that offer a WES service. Sometimes we've been asking for appropriate follow-up, and different local clinical guidelines can shape whether or not a lab is offering predictive testing, for example, on class 4 variants. So that has to be taken into consideration when marking follow-up being suggested by the laboratories. There has been some complaints or comments that there is a significant amount of reading to go around the variants within the scheme. However, trying to make a scheme that's fair for everyone is kind of the aim at the end of the day. But ultimately, the situation is false, especially as there's no clinician at the end of the phone or available by email to question or ask about the phenotype involved with the patient. There has been significant variability in the classifications for certain variants since the 2012 scheme started. The majority of labs classify the variants in a consistent manner, but there is the occasional outlier, and it's slightly concerning when they differ by 2 or more classifications, and the scheme aims to tackle the root cause of these discrepancies. In 2021, there were 2 splice variants used for the questions. One was in question 1, and one was question 3. The first question was a child that was premature and presented with hydrocephalus and had a shunt, had widespread white matter disease and cystic lesions. It was making developmental progress, but was apparently cortically blind. It's quite a non-specific presentation, and testing requested was a whole exome using the proband and the parents, and the DDU2P panel was applied for analysis. Whereas case 3 was a patient that was presenting with short stature, ataxia, and strabismus. The mother was also affected with ataxia and mild intellectual disability. So rather than doing a large generic panel, a targeted panel for ataxia and cerebral anomalies was applied. The variant detected in case 1 was +3. The variant detected in case 3 was a +5, which is a higher likelihood of being pathogenic. The patient phenotype for question 1 wasn't a good match that the variant detected, whereas the variant in question 3 fitted clinically. The variant in question 1 was in trans with a UV. The variant in question 3 was in an affected mother and in a dominant case. Question 1 had a nomad frequency of 0.03, including 1 homozygote, whereas the variant in question 3 was absent. They differed in splice predictions, however, with question 1's splice reductions being significantly higher for Maxent and NN splice. Clinical results for the first variant stated it was likely benign. The variant in case 3 was absent. However, there was a likely path reported at the same splice site in a +4 de novo case with ataxia, and the final base of the exon had been reported twice, both in patients with ataxia, once as a de novo pathogenic and once inherited as a UV. The splice variant in case 1 was scored, had a lot of variation in the scoring, from 4 labs reporting it as benign, through 24 calling it likely benign, 46 as uncertain, and 1 even as likely pathogenic. There's much more consistency in the classification for the variant question 3, with 72 reporting it as a UV, however 11 did not report it, and 3 reporting as likely pathogenic. PP3 was applied by 49 labs for case 1, but only 27 for case 3, with it being near the threshold of the ACGS criteria for cutoff. 4 labs decided that there was no bioinformatic effect predicted by it, despite there being good splice scores, which is interesting. The frequency of the variant, which was 841 times on Nomad, was interpreted very differently by laboratories, from some applying PM2 in isolation, supporting it's having a pathogenic effect, down to some labs applying both BS1 and BS2, essentially excluding it as being pathogenic. PM3 was applied by 7 labs, being opposite a UV. PP4 was applied by 2 labs for case 1, despite there not being a particularly specific presentation associated with either the child or the disorder. And 13 applied PP4 for question 3, despite there being no clinician being available for consult about the presentation. 8 applied PP1, which was co-segregation, even though there was only 1 meiosis between the affected mother and the affected child. Splice variant in question 1 is far too common considering the prevalence of the disease associated with it, and it essentially excludes it as being pathogenic. The disease is early onset progressive encephalopathy with brain atrophy and thin corpus callosum. The other end of the spectrum was the first +5 variant. However, this only had 2 lines of supporting evidence, but did have other supporting evidence that didn't quite reach the threshold to apply that evidence criteria. But it did have a potential method of follow-up, which was to test the maternal grandparents to see if it occurred de novo in the affected mother. The 2020 ACGS guidelines state that to report a VUS where further testing or investigations could be considered, as the results of those have potential to change the classification to likely pathogenic. Examples include testing parents to determine whether it's de novo, and mRNA for variants that are predicted to affect normal splicing. One of the issues is the plus or minus 2 splice sites allow the use of PVS1, whereas a splice prediction score of comparable drop can only use PP3 when outside these regions. People need to remember that publications are only guidelines and professional judgment must still be applied in certain circumstances. A good example was the 2018 EQA. In question 2, the scheme involved 2 sisters presenting with hereditary spastic paraplegia from unaffected parents, being consistent with an autosomal recessive mode of inheritance. The proband tested had 2 variants in SPG7, the 1529 CT and opposite a different variant. The 1529 CT has been described as the most common mutation causing adult onset neurogenetic disease in patients of British ancestry, as sufficient evidence available to call it pathogenic. Despite how well characterized this variant is and all the available evidence, the variant was still classified as likely pathogenic by 10 laboratories, which is 17% of the participants. I'm unsure whether this was a false situation caused by external quality assessment, and I'm not sure if people are thinking we're trying to catch them out, but when it's a clearly pathogenic variant, that's the classification that should be made. Case 2 in the 2021 scheme involved a child with symmetric overgrowth from birth, learning difficulties, episodic wrist tremor, and a variety of other additional presentation. The testing requested in this case was the DDG2P panel for the proband and the parents, and a heterozygous de novo variant was detected in EZH2. The variant was classified as pathogenic by 44 laboratories or likely pathogenic in 31 laboratories, which is very consistent. However, these classifications were reached using very different evidence or evidence at differing strengths. PS1 was applied by 50 labs, but not included by 24. However, it was applied at strong by 32 and at supporting by 8 labs. PS2 was applied by the majority of labs. However, 6 decided not to use it, with 46 applying at strong, 1 at supporting, 1 at very strong, and 21 at moderate. PM1 was applied by 41 labs, but not applied by 34. And PP4 was applied by 14 labs, not applied by 61. A reason PM1 may not have been applied by a large number of laboratories, according to Uniprot, the variant in the question occurs outside the set domain. However, Uniprot uses a different transcript to the transcript in the question, and that alters the position of and numbering of the amino acids at 724. So it does show that it occurs within the set domain, and PM1 should be applied. Many of the labs classified the variant as likely pathogenic. However, there's a large difference in the posterior probability of it being pathogenic, depending on the combination of evidence used to support this classification. The most common omissions were a combination of PS1, PM1, and PP2 not being applied, which suggested that the protein hadn't been researched much. Another possibility is once the labs had sufficient evidence to classify the variant as pathogenic, likely pathogenic, they stopped searching for further supporting information. Some of the evidence provided was just on the threshold of UV, whereas other evidence was on the threshold of pathogenic. The truncating variants in the questions had very different expected consequence. In 2012, the XPC variant occurred in exon 6, and had 3 pathogenic ClinVar entries. It's an autosomal recessive disorder. In 2014, the REAP1 variant occurred in the penultimate exon, which then led to a frame shift and a stop occurring 65 amino acids downstream, which led to a read-through of the final the naturally occurring stop codon. In 2016, there was a homozygous deletion within exon 1, which was consistent with the presentation seen in the patient. In 2017, there was a stop detected in what was at the time thought to be an autosomal recessive disorder. Since then, there's been a publication showing it occurs dominantly as well. In 2019, there was a known pathogenic variant occurring within the final exon of SRCCAP, and in 2021, there was a variant occurring in the penultimate exon, with the last exon only being 4 amino acids long. The consistency in scoring the truncation variants has varied. 28 labs classified the XPC1 variant as pathogenic, whereas one called it likely pathogenic, and I assume this was because a second variant hadn't been detected in the gene. The read-through and for the REAP1 variant caused a number of labs to classify this as likely pathogenic, and showed a good consideration of what the predicted outcome would be for that particular variant and its effect in the transcript. The CRTAP variant was classified as class 5 by 31 labs, but the population frequency of the variant led to 13 classifying as class 4 likely pathogenic. The C9orf12 variant had a split of 16 labs classifying it as class 5, 27 as class 4, and 10 as class 3. It was before the Tayun algorithms, and this would still be allowed to be used at pathogenic, at strong, PVS1 to be used at strong for this case. It was used as very strong by 37 laboratories and not used by 8 laboratories. The SRCCAP variant was classified by all labs as class 5. However, it was used at PVS1 was used at very strong by 33 labs, despite the Tayun algorithm being available. 25 correctly downgraded to strong, 6 didn't use it, and 10 labs didn't supply ACGS criteria for that question, which reflected the slow uptake for people using the evidence criteria. The variant for TBCD in the 2021 scheme, 4 labs classified this as pathogenic, 5 as likely pathogenic, with 66 using it classifying it as a class 3. The PVS1 should be altered to moderate in this case if you use the Tayun algorithm, as it occurs within the penultimate exon and the final exon is less than 10% of the coding region. 5 labs applied this PVS1 at very strong, 3 at strong, 58 correctly at moderate, 1 at supporting, 6 didn't use it, and 2 didn't supply any criteria. Despite there being a prescribed algorithm that's available widely on the SVI website and we've sort of added into the scheme, it still shows that there's significant variability in how labs are using guidelines and whether or not they're using guidelines. Thanks.
Thanks for a really nice presentation, David. I'm just going to start presenting the slides again.
Lovely, thanks, Dave. And again, thank you, David, for that. I think it shows that standardization is coming, but with it, it also still brings its challenges, definitely. So I would just please ask you to submit your questions in the questions box, and we will go through them when we go to the live session. And now I'm going to hand back to Dave, who's going to give us an update of our EQAs. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Hopefully the slides are showing again.
They are. Thanks, Dave.
Good. Great. So I'm just going to tell you a bit about the EQAs that are coming up for 2022. But just to go back to the 2021 EQA, I've just got an example here of the kind of information that we send out with the cases. So on the right-hand side, you can see the information that we sent out for case 1 in 2021. There was 3 cases. So you can see that we give quite a lot of background information, clinical information. In this particular case, we've also given some family information. This was a trio. We've given the testing that was performed, the results towards the bottom of that case, and then we would ask the participating labs to classify the variant or variants. Obviously, in this case, there was 2 variants. And we have 2 versions of the EQA. So there's a classification only EQA. So if that's all that your lab does, you can take part in that EQA. You can classify the variant, and then you'd be assessed just on the classification. If your lab prepares clinical reports, then it would be more appropriate to take part in the classification and interpretation version of the EQA. So it's very much up to you. Obviously, you should choose the EQA for the testing that you carry out in your lab. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see this is the form that we use for the classification of the SNVs. You can see it asks for the classification system used, any supplementary or additional guidelines that have been used, and then obviously this form's cut off, but we've got all the particular rules that you could use, the level that you've applied them, and then you can also provide the evidence for those as well. So going on to 2022, as in previous years, we're offering the classification only and the classification and interpretation EQAs. They're actually going out slightly later this year than they have done in previous years. So that's the 10th of October. So there's still time. If you wanted to sign up, you can still do that. If you just contact us by the information that we provide later in this presentation. But I should say that variant classification also comes up as part of most of the molecular genetic EQAs that we run, actually. And we'll be asking for variant classification information and evidence, and also we'll be providing our classification and evidence for the variants for these EQAs as well, where applicable. And at the bottom of the screen, I've just shown some of the other variant classification EQAs that we offer at GenQA. Possibly one that would be relevant for this audience would be the exome sequencing data interpretation EQA. And for this EQA, we provide a list of variants that were detected in a trio and the clinical information for the trio. And then you'd pick the most relevant EQAs and then you classify those variants, and then you'd produce a fully interpretive clinical report, which is what will be assessed. And as I mentioned, previously we've used this variant classification form, and what you had to do was fill in this form for each variant, so 1 form per variant. But an improvement we're trying to make for participants is to have an online form, or an online form where you can actually fill in the information directly online for all the variants all in one place, so you don't need to be uploading separate documents for each variant. So we hope that will make the process a bit simpler for people. And just one more EQA I thought I'd mention. So there's also, this is a sample-based EQA. Unfortunately, it's going out very soon this year. So you could sign up for next year though, but this is a variant validation EQA. So it's where you would validate a variant detected on a research basis. So we send out DNA sample or samples. It generally includes family follow-up studies, so it's generally a trio. And from 2022 onwards, we're including information for SNVs and CNVs. So you provide the variant classification for those, and again, it's a fully interpretive clinical report. So that was just a little summary of some of the EQAs that we offer. And now back to Sandy.
Great, thank you, Dave. Very interesting, and I think just the remit and the expansion of the different types of EQAs that we're now providing is really in response to what the labs are asking for, and it shows just a change in the type of work that's happening, you know, in the field in clinical science. So, yes, thank you for that update. We've got some questions coming in. The first one is quite a general one. So we all know that the ACMG guidelines are being reviewed. Does anyone have any inclination of any changes that are afoot of when they are supposed to be coming out? I don't know if anyone's heard anything.
I don't know if David would be better answering that one. I'd heard possibly later this year or next year.
Yeah, yeah.
Is David there?
No inside information from
There he
David.
is.
No, sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think what I've heard is they're definitely doing the rounds at the moment, and a lot of meetings to try and get agreement, and they were planning, I think, for January next year, but I do hear it may be delayed slightly, but I guess that's going to be of interest, and definitely we would put any links of updates through our website and our comms as well, so everyone is is made aware of them. David,
Sandy, I did hear there was some changes to the class 3 variants, particularly as well, where they're where we'd be able to split out the class 3 variants a bit more. I know people now use hot or cold or warm or that kind of thing. So I think there's going to be a better system for the class 3 variants.
I think so.
Yeah, I think it depends on which system you're using and which if you're still using the 2015, that's still not in there. So that's one of the problems when marking, because people are adhering to the ACGS or sometimes they still the ACMG, so it just causes an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to that, the diagram that we all see, that the class 3 is a very, very long category, whereas your 1, 2s, 4, 5s are, much easier to define. Right, David, we've got some very specific questions coming in. So the first one is, can you explain Z-score used for PP2 rule, as you mentioned in case 2?
PP, the Z-score, is for in case 2. Case 2 in which year?
Let's have a look through the slides and see if we can focus.
Well, there's actually one earlier on that. It says case 1 variant 1, and it's asking, so PP3 plus BS2 plus BS1 should be benign, however it's classified as a BUS. Can you explain? So I guess the explanation for that is BS2 and BS1 should overrule PP3 supportive information, but in certain criteria, it's if there's any conflicting evidence, so there's a pro and a con, then you go with UV. So that was traditionally the method, but that's why, because of the two heavily exclusive criteria of the strong, that's why we accepted that answer as well.
Okay, thank you, David. Another one just to put you on the spot. So PVS1 and PP3 cannot be used both together, I think they mean, even in a case where the variant can cause 2 possible mechanisms of disruption of gene function.
Yeah, so I think you kind of have to pick which is the most likely, or pick which is the most detrimental and go with that. I don't think you can sort of hedge your bets and back 2 separate mutational mechanisms. I think that ends up sort of, you're essentially kind of scoring. I don't think you can do it in an additive way. I think you can do them separately, but I don't think it can be a cumulative score from those 2 mechanisms.
Okay, thank you. So sort of prioritize the way that you interpret the evidence, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you either have to sort of pick, like I say, one mechanism or the other. I guess if there's a premature termination, that's then going to mean that the transcript's not being used, then obviously it doesn't matter if it splices out or not. However, if that's going to escape in a subset, then maybe you can. So it's sort of a case-by-case basis. But I think ultimately you can't really add to.
Thank you, David, for that one. Okay, another one, case 1 variant 1. So PP3 supporting, BS2 strong, and BS1 strong.
Oh, that was the one I went back to, sorry.
Right, so you're happy with that one then, yeah?
Yeah.
That's great, thank you. I'm just scrolling through. Farah and Dave, can I come to you? Somebody's asked about poor performance. So this is very much a lab-based EQA, and it's very different from some of the disease-causing EQAs, you know, disease-based assessments that we do. So how can we apply poor performance and when something is a true error, when some of the classifications are quite subjective, aren't they, as we've just seen?
Well, we've got the marking criteria that we use and the cases that we set are all ratified by our specialist advisory group, which they're all experts in their field in classifying variants, and they do that as in their day-to-day jobs. And we do get appeals, and we do get feedback, and we do get people using. Sometimes it is completely justified as well. That somebody, I mean, you do get the opportunity to appeal against the score that you've got, and we'll consider any evidence that you submit. And sometimes it can be guidelines can differ between countries. You know, the follow-on work can differ depending where you are. And obviously, that over the years, the guidelines have changed and been updated, and people use different guidelines as well. And we try and take all of that into account when we're doing the assessment, and also when people appeal, we would take all of that into account as well. And it is very much an educational sort of EQA as well. So we do provide as much feedback as we can to the participants.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And Farah, another question to you is, because obviously EQA, we've got a huge educational element of what we deliver as well, and we're always getting requests of sharing the variants for classification and, you know, educational. So there's a question come in saying, can we share EQA cases, you know, to labs who haven't participated before?
Yeah, we're happy to do that. Actually, for all of our EQAs, we always make the previous year's EQA summary report available as well. So we're happy to share information, because there's obviously information that one can learn to apply for the forthcoming year. So we encourage people to always see the previous EQA summary reports.
And where's that available about, Farah? Is that on the website?
Yeah, if you log into your GenQA website account, where the documents are available, the distribution letter, there's always a section as well for the previous year's EQA summary report. But if you ever have any questions, please just email info@genqa.org and we'll get back to you straight away.
Great, thanks, Farah. So Dave mentioned about country-specific interpretation and those different elements that we've got to think about, which leads very nicely onto this next question, which is, considering the variation in application of the ACMG categories, is there less variation when considering the UK-only labs, or when considering only the use of the ACGS labs? And applying obviously the UK guidelines. Is that something that we see?
There is, I mean, there's still outliers, and there's still, I mean, as you saw from the presentation, there's still one of the labs is still using the 2019 guidelines, and those are ACGS specific. So again, there's a core number of labs that are using ACGS, and then there's a few sort of that aren't. Generally, we have actually broken it down into UK only, and again, there are still a few outliers, but it's generally quite consistent.
Yeah, that's good. That's good to know. So I think the ACGS would be happy that all their work to help standardisation is coming to fruition, but as with everything, there's still outliers that we see. Thanks, David, for that. Okay, another technical one for you, David, I'm afraid. Do you agree with the use of PBS1 very strong in cases where there are truncating variants in the last exon, which should theoretically escape MND?
Yes, I think that's, you can if there's downstream variants that have been reported, stop variants that have been reported. There's some, especially in that SRC cap, it's got a significant number of variants downstream of it that have been proven to be pathogenic. So I think you've got to take that into consideration. I don't think you can just say in isolation that you can. I think in certain circumstances where there's additional information that shows it is an actual mutational mechanism, then that's okay. I mean, there's examples where you do get variants in the last exon that aren't. So yeah, it's dependent on whether it's a gain of function or loss of function, I guess, or haploid deficiency. You've got to take those into consideration as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's another one here. So there's some differences between the CANVIG cancer gene interpretation guidelines and the main ACGS guidelines, especially regarding the use of different criteria together. Are there plans to look at whether these can be aligned? At the moment, we're being advised. Oh, yeah, at the moment we've been advised. Oh, sorry, I can't keep going down. To use the criteria differently. Any comments on that, David?
I think that's just a reflection of the fact that it's extremely hard to have one rule set for different questions. So that's cancer predisposition, and it's whether or not you still apply those same rule set to something that's a fully penetrant single gene disorder. I think that's basically what is trying to be teased out in the CANVIG guidelines. I think it's actually quite sensible to diverge a little bit in certain circumstances, because the ask is different in those different sets of presentations.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's where the expertise and people's judgment and clinical scientist expertise and clinical teams, whereby you use your knowledge to adapt the guidelines, because as you say, one set doesn't fit absolutely every scenario out there.
Yeah, the guidelines, the main guidelines, don't do well with risk factors at all. One of the biggest variation bubble plots we ever had was for a Stargardt's variant that's been seen. I think it's been seen in sort of 6% of the normal population, but it's enriched in the Stargardt's population, and it's sometimes in cis or in cis with a pathogenic variant that you don't detect. So that was classified from likely pathogenic all the way down to benign. So there's still things that don't fit into the main classification guidance particularly well. So I think there's going to be more and more additions and amendments to those to catch them and things to sort of accommodate things like that.
Sure, and I guess that's the purpose of one of the purposes of this EQA. It's education, isn't it? That you have to be aware that there are variables out there when you're classifying.
Yeah, I mean, by and large, the scheme's answered extremely well by all the participants, and the answers that are provided are, they're generally very consistent. It's just there's the odd outlier who may or may not be particularly familiar with them. So it's not supposed to be a punitive kind of scheme. It's supposed to be sort of an educational scheme where people can learn from things and hopefully apply that to their daily diagnostic cases.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, panel, David and Dave and Farah. Do you want to just move on the next slide, please? Yep. So just to say that we are trying to keep a good social media outreach there. We've got lots of things going on. We have Focus On webinars every month, and we also are planning a participants meeting at ESHG that will be also streamed live on focusing on NIPT testing, and we have multiple events throughout the year. So we do try and communicate with all of our labs, not just heads of labs or quality managers that maybe are our primary contacts on the website. We do have tweets and other notifications through social media. So please do get in touch if you would like to be added onto any comms links or look for us on social media. And then finally, just to say thank you very much indeed for participating and joining us today. Feedback's always very welcome, as with EQAs, feedback from the way we run them, or comments, or whether you want to be involved as an assessor or an expert panel, then we're always very keen to hear from you. But in particular for these Focus On webinars, we'd like to hear what you thought about them, and whether there's something else, another topic that you would like us to start thinking about for future webinars. So the idea is that this webinar will be available to everyone who's registered for the next month, and then it will be made available on the GenQA YouTube channel. You'll also receive a participation certificate for attending today. And just a quick news flash for May 2022, the next Focus On topic will be on fusion testing in solid tumours. So it just leaves me to thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you found it incredibly helpful webinar. Huge thank you to David Moore, not only for his time and presentation today, but also for your never-ending support with the EQAs. And we look forward to 2022 SNV EQA coming up, and also to Dave and Farah for the GenQA help and support in delivering these EQAs, and for the technical team in the background who have supported this webinar. Thank you everyone indeed.